Roman numeral 4, Colonial Society. This is our fourth set of notes in our first unit on colonial America. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the changes in colonial society that occurred in the 17th and early 18th centuries. As you can see from this beginning's PowerPoint slide, we'll be looking at Southern society and New England society, white America as well as African Americans in colonial America, and the changes that they went through and why those changes occurred. We're going to start off with Southern society in the 17th century. At the very beginning, when we look at the South in the 17th century, the 1600s, there were very few women who came to Maryland or who came to Virginia or South Carolina. It was a money-making scheme, and people who came to Jamestown were looking to make money, make it rich, and then go back home. And it was very dangerous. There was a high mortality rate. And so it was mostly young men who came looking to seek their fortune in America, which means very few women. And so there weren't very many families in the South in the 17th century, at the early 17th century. Because of that, we're not going to see families, like I said, and we're also going to see that there will be very few children being born in the South. And even if those children are born, let's say a few women do come over, there are a few women who come over as indentured servants. They're mostly men, but there are a few women who come over, and we see that they will have, it's very rare that you're going to have a two-parent family. Either the mom will die in childbirth, or the dad will die from a disease or a Native American attack or starvation or something like that. So we don't have a very cohesive communal family structure among white people in the first half or so of the 17th century. Because of that, for the few women that are in Virginia at this time period, they have more freedom than they might have back in England or, as we will find out, in New England. Whenever there is a scarcity of something, its value goes up, and so there was a scarcity of women. And so if you're a woman who comes to Virginia at this time, you have all kinds of options to get married. So women typically would get married to the wealthier plantation owners or the wealthier elite in Virginia, and so the poor men wouldn't have the option to get married because women had their choice. In addition to that, men died off so quickly that it was not uncommon for women to inherit the farm, for women to be in charge of the business. And so we see that women have a lot more freedom just because they're scarcer. They're more valuable than the average man because there's just fewer of them. The next thing we're going to talk about is the role of tobacco on shaping Southern society. Tobacco is, of course, our first cash crop that we have in the South, especially in North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland. Because there's such a craze for growing tobacco, we're going to see that the South will develop into a very rural community. People have to be spread out. The larger the plantation, the larger the farm, the more tobacco you get. And so we see that there are very few towns in the South. Everybody wants to go out, set up your farm as big as possible, and so that spreads people out. And so the South will have very few large-scale settlements. The ones that they do have will be on the coast and function as ports, but even those are fairly small. This will be in contrast, of course, to what we'll talk about up in New England. Next, we're not going to see, as time goes on, very much industry develop in the South, either in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries, 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries. We're not going to see a lot of industry in the South because you have cash crops. And if you have money in your pocket and you live in the South, look at your options. You can either invest your money in some kind of manufacturing, which may or may not succeed, or you can invest it into cash crop farming like tobacco or later cotton, and that's much more of a guaranteed return on your investment. And so we're going to see that this is going to lock up a lot of the capital in the South, and that's going to be the way that people make money. So it's very little economic diversity in the South. They're kind of a one-crop economy, which is great during high tobacco prices, but it's going to be devastating during low tobacco prices. And their economy is going to go up and down in a boom and bust cycle. In addition to that, we're going to see that since it's a cash crop economy, wealth in the South is determined not by how much money you have necessarily, but how much land you own. Because land equals the more land you have, the more tobacco you grow. And so the richest people in the South, sometimes you could think of them as land-rich, cash-poor. They have lots of land, they can grow lots of tobacco, but they don't have a lot of capital or cash on hand. In addition to that, wealth is also measured by how much labor you can control. If you need to have the two things to really grow that tobacco, you need to have lots of land, and then you have access to lots of cheap labor. And so if you have both of those things, you're considered one of the elite, one of the planters, one of the people who control Southern society. This is going to lead to class conflict. If we look at this map of the South, most of the really good tobacco-growing land is along the coastal regions, sometimes called the Tidewater region of Virginia. And that is flat land, well-watered, access to the ocean so you can trade with England with your tobacco, rich soil. But what happens is, in the 17th century, most of the labor needs, the early part of the 17th century, most of the people are going to be picking and growing tobacco for these elite. They're going to be indentured servants. They're poor people. There's an excess of labor in England, so they're poor people who sold themselves into semi-slavery for a period of 4 to 7 years, and then they got to America, and these indentured servants would then work off the price of their trip over to the colonies for 4 to 7 years, and then once their indentured time was over, if they survived, which is a very big if, it's very dangerous in the New World, like I said, for reasons before, starvation, Indian attacks, those kinds of things. If they survive, then they're free. But the problem is that these former indentured servants, they want land, that's why they came here, but there's no good land available. It has all been taken up by these rich planter elite along the coast, and so they have to go further inland into the Piedmont and then into the upcountry, where it's hillier, it's in the Appalachian Mountains, and you can't grow as much tobacco there. The soil is rockier, it's cooler, it's not flat, and so we see that the people who are these freed indentured servants remain poor and very resentful. They see that their colony is controlled by these East Coast elite who used to employ them, and they have all, as I mentioned, all the women who come over, they have all the money, they have all the land, the good land, and for that reason they also have all the political and economic power in the colony. So there is this East-West tension that develops in the South. The East, of course, is the elite, the politically and economically powerful plantation owners, and then the West are the upcountry poor indentured servants or former indentured servant farmers. Next, we're going to see also that this is reflected in the political structure. There's some political resentment. If you look at this close-up of what Virginia used to look like, we see that there are, along the coast in the far right-hand corner, there's going to be less people because that's going to be dominated by the planter elite. And they're going to be the ones that were there at the start of the colony or have most of the money. And then the indentured servants, when they're set free or run away and they move up into the hill country, there's going to be a lot of them. But the people who controlled the colony from the beginning are the plantation elite. And so they're going to make sure that the system is rigged to benefit them. So even though the planters on the East Coast have less people, when we talk about having an elected representative democracy, they're going to get more seats in the House of Burgesses, their, if you will, Parliament or Congress in Virginia, than the people who live much more out west. And this seems to be unfair. Why shouldn't one person get the same amount of representation as another person? And so we're going to see that the upcountry poor farmers are going to be resentful of all the things that's on this slide, but they're also going to be resentful because the whole political system is geared against them. It's geared to favor the East Coast elite towards the right-hand side of this map. So we have a bunch of angry West Coast farmers. And we're going to see that this is, or Western farmers, we're going to see that this is a trend in American history, this East-West tension. The poor people are going to move out west looking for new opportunity, new land, and they're going to resent the power and privilege of the East Coast elite. And we'll see this, like I said, again and again as we go through this course. So here's our best example of East-West tension in the 17th century, something called Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, a date to remember. What happened is the governor of the colony, a guy by the name of Governor Berkeley, he was one of these East Coast elite, and he was making some of his money by selling whiskey and weapons to Native Americans out west in return for furs. This is a way for him to make it rich, not just for his plantation, but for this fur trade. And if you're one of these indentured servants or former indentured servants living in the upcountry, of course, Native Americans, they attack you all the time, and you attack them. There's lots of conflict. The indentured servants are further west. They're in more contact with the Native Americans. And so we see that If you find out as a former indentured servant that your governor is selling weapons and alcohol to the Native Americans that you're constantly fighting, you're going to be really mad. And so when they found this out, this is the spark that just sets off this revolution, if you will, this rebellion. Now, remember all of the things that were simmering before. If we had talked about all of these things. The former indentured servants were resentful of the East Coast because, the East Coast got all the land. They got the women to marry them. They had all the political power, all the economic prestige. And so when we put on top of that, that you found out that your governor is selling weapons to Indians or Native Americans who are trying to attack you, that's a last straw. And so these former indentured servants are going to follow this man named Nathaniel Bacon, which is what the revolution is named after, and they are going to first form and attack the Native Americans on the frontier, and then once they do that, then they turn their anger and their resentment to the East Coast elite. And they go, and there's Nathaniel Bacon in the middle, and they burn down the colonial capital, Jamestown. Berkeley will run away bravely because he doesn't want to get killed by this mob. And so eventually what happens is Nathaniel Bacon will die of sickness, and when he dies, the revolution kind of crumbles without their leader. And so we see the governor come back with forces that are paid for and created by the other East Coast elite, and they crush the rebellion. And so the rebellion doesn't change anything. I mean, it is an example. So let's talk about what's an example of, why it's important. Well, it's an example of this East-West tension I've been talking about. So there is internal conflict in the colonies. We can also see this somewhat as a revolution to some extent against colonial authority, against British authority, because the British government, even though they don't pay attention too much to Virginia, they are okay with the governor. Obviously, he is, he has been approved by the British Crown, and so by rebelling against the British governor, you're kind of rebelling against the British government. But in much more, we should view it as an internal rebellion between the upcountry poor farmers and the East Coast elite. But there's also another important reason, a result of this, is that we're going to see that East Coast planters, they realize their mistake. They realize that as long as they keep bringing in more and more indentured servants as laborers to grow their tobacco, they're creating future rebellions, because we bring in more indentured servants and then free them, but they're poor, and so they'll rebel because they're resentful, and we'll have another rebellion in the future. And so why should we continue to bring in more indentured servants who are just going to rebel? And so we see in 1676 one of the reasons that we move from using white indentured servants to African slaves as a labor force is because of Bacon's rebellion. There are others, of course, that we'll talk about in a minute, but this is one of the reasons why we see this switch from white indentured servant labor to African labor on plantations in the South. It makes sense if you're a white Southern plantation owner, because if you bring in African slaves to work on your plantation, you see they are never set free. So they are never free enough to rebel. And this seems like a good solution. We can still grow our tobacco, we can still make our large profits, but we don't have to face future rebellions, hopefully, because we're never going to create a class of free, angry farmers out west who will rebel against us, because our African slaves will always remain tied to the land here in the East and always enslaved and unfree. They can never rebel. So this seems to be a solution for the South. And so we see that we're going to see the numbers of African slaves will go up dramatically after 1676. So that brings us, of course, to the issue of slavery. So let's talk about slavery in the South. Now, if you remember, we had talked about in previous lectures, slavery was indeed in every one of the 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies, but was more in the South because there's more of an economic reason for slavery. There is a desire to grow cash crops. You need the cheapest labor possible, and so people are using slaves, like I said, especially after Bacon's Rebellion. But there are other reasons why slavery starts to eclipse using indentured servants, is that there are going to be fewer indentured servants available. In England, after about 1676, the economy of England is going to start to take off again. They're in the early stages of their industrial revolution. They're starting to manufacture things more, so there is more of a need for labor in England. And when that happens, the pool of potential desperate poor white people willing to risk their lives and become an indentured servant and come to America dries up. They figure, why should I risk my life if there are jobs here in England? And so another reason slavery starts to supplant indentured servitude in America is because in England the economy gets better and the pool of indentured servants shrinks. Next, the Royal African Company is a British company that had exclusive rights to conduct the slave trade from Africa to the English colonies in the South. It was the only company that was legally able to do this, and so they had a monopoly on the slave trade, which meant that slave prices were very high. So before 1676, a reason to not use slaves and to use indentured servants is because the price of slaves was just so high. There were so few of them coming over because the British African Company had a monopoly that it made more economic sense to use an indentured servant because he was cheaper than using one of these expensive and relatively rare African slaves. But around 1676, the British government is persuaded to get rid of that monopoly. And so the Royal African Company no longer has exclusive rights to bring slaves over from Africa to the New World, so many companies get involved. And of course, there's a surplus now, a surge of African slaves coming to the New World, which makes their price go down. Taken with all these other factors that we've mentioned, it now makes economic sense and political sense, if you want to think of it that way, to use African slaves over white indentured servants. So for all of these reasons, we see that African slavery starts to eclipse the use of indentured servants, which is an economic change. So let's talk about how slaves actually got here. So we're going to talk about the triangular trade, obviously a very important part of AP American history. So let's start with Africa. In Africa, of course, we're going to see lots of slaves come from Africa, and most of them are going to come from West Africa because it's closer to the New World that we want to use their labor for. A few of slaves will come from East Africa, but by and large, most of the slaves are going to come from the west coast of Africa. Now, how are these slaves taken? Well, white Europeans, they don't know really what's on the inside of Africa because they die from malaria when they ever try to go in. And so what they do is they contract or pay local African tribal leaders along the coast to go into the interior to capture African slaves and to bring them to the coast. In return, the Europeans will pay these African tribal leaders on the coast in the form of rum or finished products or with guns, which allows them to go get even more slaves. And so they bring them to the coast. Now, once the African tribal leaders have taken their fellow Africans and sold them to the Europeans, they're loaded on a boat and they're taken across the Atlantic to the New World. By far, the vast majority of African slaves are going to go to Brazil or they're going to go to the Caribbean because that's where they grow sugar. And sugar is another cash crop that has even higher profits than tobacco. And so there's an insatiable demand for African slave labor in the Caribbean and in Brazil for this labor force. And they can afford to pay higher prices because they make so much profit off of the sugar. However, we do see some African slaves that are taken to the British colonies in North America to grow tobacco. Now, so if I'm a slave trader who owns this ship full of slaves, I sail across the Atlantic, I unload my cargo of slaves and sell them to the highest bidder, and then what I do is I have an empty ship, and I can't have that because I'm in the shipping business, and so I now load it with sugar or tobacco or later cotton or indigo, and I have all these raw materials. So I have a boat full of raw materials now. So what I do, more than likely, is I head back to Europe. In this case, England, because we're talking about the English slave trade, but it could have been France or Spain if we're talking about their slave trade. And I unload my boat full of raw materials back in London or Liverpool or whatever port I'm headed to, Plymouth, and I sell those raw materials. Now, the British use those raw materials to make finished goods. Like I said, employing more people in England, so there's less of a rate of unemployment. And so now I have a boat full of finished goods. And of course, where do I sail? Back to Africa, and I use those finished goods and rum and guns or whatever to buy even more slaves. And then I go back across the Atlantic, and it's this slave triangle that runs continuously again and again and again, bringing massive amounts of Africans to the Americas. Now, this slave triangle took many forms. Of course, instead of going back to England, you could have gone from the Caribbean or the South to Massachusetts or New England because there's some manufacturing there. And so we could have drawn many different ways that the slave triangle worked. Here I just have two. Either the destination is back to England and then to Africa, or to the north and back to Africa. But this is known as the Atlantic world. This is the Atlantic trade. And so what we can see here is AP wants you to know that its North American colonies are closely tied into their overall British imperial trade network. They're integral to part of this. The British use their colonies to gain raw materials. They also use their colonies to gain wealth back for the mother country. And so we see that England is economically tied very close, if not politically, economically to her colonies. So let's talk about one important part of the slave triangle, the Middle Passage, the part of the triangle that we take human beings from Africa and then sell them to the New World. So the Middle Passage, this is a very famous diagram of one of these slave ships that are sailing across the Atlantic from Africa to either the Caribbean, Brazil, or the southern colonies of what will be the United States. And we see that Africans are packed extremely tight on these boats. And often, in many cases, they're laid down, they're chained, and they have to stay that way with very few breaks to get up and exercise on deck or get some fresh air for weeks on end. It could be 3 weeks, it could be a couple of months, depending on the winds, how quickly the boat can make the journey. Now, of course, this is obviously, it goes without saying, very inhumane to treat humans this way and to tie them and to bind them on these boats. Imagine laying on this boat, even just for 3 weeks, chained, and you can't move. People around you are hopeless. You know you're never going to see your home again, your friends, your family, your wife, your children. And so you're hopeless, and people around you are either seasick or they're sick because they're getting European diseases. And so we see people vomiting around you, maybe on top of you. They can't get up and go to the bathroom, and so you have to deal with that. So we see that disease is a common problem on these slave ships. And if one slave gets sick, of course, that in these close quarters, another slave will get sick and another one. And then if you're the captain who owns the ship and you make your money based on how many slaves you can get from Africa to the New World and sell, you don't want these slaves to get sick. And so in the first hint of sickness, you might unshackle one of these slaves and get them off your boat and throw them overboard to their death. And so we see that of these hundreds of thousands of slaves that come across from Africa to the New World, the first part of their journey, the Middle Passage into slavery, is certainly a horrendous one. Once a slave would get to the New World, they are unloaded off the boat and they are going to be sold at auction. Usually maybe about 1 or 2 weeks from when they get off the boat to when they go on the auction block. The reason we have this lag in time is because the person who has purchased the slaves and is going to sell them at the auction block to a potential plantation owner, they know that they're not going to get a very high price for each slave right off the boat. They're sickly, they're emaciated, they've barely been fed enough to survive, to keep costs down, and so they need to, quote-unquote, fatten the slaves up. They need to get them a little bit healthier so they'll bring a better price. And so we see on auction day, we'll have a doctor come in and he'll look at the slaves and he'll try to treat their wounds. They'll grease them up so their skin looks shinier, healthier. And then we see that the slaves, unlike in this picture, we'll see that the slaves are often stripped down to be naked. And so that the people who are buying them can see any deformities, they can see any injuries, and so, of course, another dehumanizing experience if you're a slave and you're forced to stand there naked in front of all these people who poke and prod you, who look at your teeth, who make you dance and move, lift things to see when they spend their money on you if they're getting a sickly slave or not. And so we see that this is obviously very embarrassing and, like I said, dehumanizing. But another aspect of that is that on the auction block, slaves will purposely be split up from their families and friends and tribal members that they may have been captured with. The reason for this is that if you're a plantation owner, you don't want these new slaves who are more likely to rebel because they're new to slavery, plotting a rebellion. And so you will separate them up into different tribes. And of course, there are many, many tribes in Africa and many languages. And so you couldn't plot your escape if you don't speak the language of anybody else. Of course, this is horrible. I mean, it goes without saying of all the other things we've said, but to now be into this new country, this new world, you don't know what's going on, and to be torn apart from your friends or family or daughter or husband, it just makes this experience all the more crushing. Next, let's say now that you have been purchased by a plantation owner, and now you're going to go to live on the plantation. So what is life like on a plantation for a slave? Well, first of all, most of the slaves will be on these large plantations. There are, of course, slave owners who are maybe middle class or upper lower class who own a few slaves, maybe 20, maybe 10, maybe just one. But most of the slaves will be put on these large plantations, especially as we go into the 19th century. And they live communally. So if you're a plantation owner, it's all about, you're a businessman. You want to lower your costs to raise your profits. And so for the slaves that you brought in, you're not going to build a slave cabin for every single slave or every single slave family. You're going to make them live in these large slave cabins where you may have 10 to 20 people living communally all together. So no privacy. You will probably work 6 days a week. Sundays usually were the slaves had off, unless it was harvesting or planting season, and then you have to either get the crop planted right now, so it has time to grow, or harvested right now before it spoils. But for the most part, Sundays were off because that is the Lord's Day. That is the day that the plantation owner will take off because it's Sunday and he needs to go to church, and so he'll let the slaves do that too. And then typically slaves would also have maybe a week or two or maybe 3 days, depending on the plantation and what you're growing and where you are, off at Christmas time. That's a lull in the farming season, and so there isn't as much work for them to do. But we see that it's very hard work for slaves. They get up before sunrise, and they work throughout the day, and then they go to bed after sunset. So this is hard, backbreaking work. The next thing I want to mention about communal living is if we look here, we see in this picture that slaves, of course, want to create community among themselves. Even though they're new to this plantation, they don't know anybody, they want to learn the language, so they'll learn the language at some point. Usually it's a blending of their own African language with some of the other African languages that are on the plantation, or the English language that their owners speak, and so we get this thing called Creole, which is a blending of these different languages. But Africans will also seek community through marriage. They'll marry other slaves on the plantation, or they may look as the oldest person is like an aunt or an uncle, even though they're not related. They're going to try to create that family, that extended family experience, because human beings need support. They need to feel like they're part of something so it's not so isolating. In addition to that, Africans will try to keep some of their own traditions in slavery. So we see in this picture that Africans are dancing a traditional African dance. They also have some African instruments here. The banjo is an African instrument, and this can be brought over to America and eventually adopted by white Americans. Also the drums that you can see in this picture. And so we see that Africans will do their best to maintain some of their culture that they're allowed to, that they can hope to, as well as blending with white English culture also. I talked about marriages. Marriages were not legal because African Americans were not considered people. And so the law did not recognize their marriages. But of course, putting that aside, everyone seeks to have companionship and, like I said, community. And so African Americans would often get married. It would be unofficial, but they would get married. It was official to them. And oftentimes in the marriage vows, it wouldn't be until death do us part. It would be until death or distance do us part. Because at any time, your owner could sell you or your wife or husband or your children to another plantation, maybe to pay off debts or to make some money or what have you. And so family life was very tenuous. You never knew when it could dramatically change and you would be separated from your family or wife or husband. Women on a plantation would do just as hard of work as men did. They would be out in the fields. They would be, helping to harvest and plant the tobacco, or later the cotton and those kind of things. But also, women not only had to face the work, and they also had to face any punishments that the men would get, but they also had the added difficulty of facing the male plantation owner. It was not uncommon for white male plantation owners to rape their female slaves because they have complete control over them. And they did this either for personal gratification, or they did this because when a child results from this rape, even though that child's father is the plantation owner, they're still considered a slave. And so then the father, the plantation owner, can sell his own child to another plantation and make a profit off of this. And so we see that this is something additional that women had to worry about on plantations as well. Songs. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you're doing a chore or something, or maybe you're doing your homework, and you have this monotonous thing. Let's hope it's not U.S. history homework that's so monotonous, but you're doing it, and you either listen to music or sing music to make the time go by a little bit faster, to get your mind off the drudgery. And of course, African Americans did that too. When they were out in the field doing field work, there would be this kind of choral singing that would go on. One slave would sing a passage, and then the rest of the slaves would respond in chorus. And you can still see this in some church services and in some choral pieces that we still have around today. And so in these songs, this would give people some hope. It would help pass the time. It would create community. But also, as we'll talk about later, it was a way for them to perhaps ridicule or make fun of their owners. They would put verses in the song that would make fun of the owners, and the owners wouldn't know this, so it's a form of defiance and authority. And later on, when we talk about the Underground Railroad or ways of slaves escaping, they might hide some verses in the song that would tell you where the place to run away was in the song, all kind of underneath the owner's knowledge. In the South, slavery got harder the further south you went. So if you were in Maryland and Virginia growing tobacco, of course that's hard work. But then if you went down into South Carolina and the main crop there is rice, that's even harder, more dangerous work. There is more of a chance of disease, catching disease in the swamps, these rice paddies of South Carolina. Also, the profits go up if you go even further south into the Caribbean and start growing sugar. The profits go up, and so human life becomes less important. If you have very large profits, you don't care if you beat your slave to death because, you're making enough profits, you can buy a new slave. The further north you go, if you go into, like I said, Maryland or Virginia, they are growing tobacco, and the profit margin is not as high, and so typically slave owners did not beat their slaves to death because they would then have to buy a new slave, and their profit margins aren't high enough to make that profit. And so we can see that this is something we'll talk more about in the future. But the further south you went, the harsher life got, and the shorter your life expectancy. Now, did slaves resist slavery? Of course they did. There are many ways that slaves resisted this bondage that they didn't want to be in. Some of them took the form of running away. Running away is a form of resistance. However, most instances of running away were not successful. Because if you run away, where are you going to go? You either have to go a long ways north, eventually when northern states will abolish slavery, but that's way into the future. We're not going to talk about that yet. Even in the northern colonies, there was slavery, so that's not really going to help you out. You could try to go west and live among the Native Americans, and maybe they accept you, maybe they don't. Maybe they kill you. You can try to go south, but there's just more slave colonies south. And so there's not a lot of places to go. Plus, you're running away without any food, without any shelter. And so most times, slaves running away, it was maybe for a short time, and they would eventually get captured or turn themselves in rather than face starvation. Next, another way to resist is to work slow. Now, you don't do this overtly, but you do this gradually over time. You work a little bit less and less and less every day, and so that you're kind of training the plantation owner to expect less from you. And so we see that this is a way to resist the plantation owners trying to get you to work harder by you just purposely work slow, and so you have to do less during the day. Next, play dumb. Right? Your plantation owner says, I want you to do these 3 things today, this, this, and this. And you're like, well, geez, I only heard the first thing, and I don't remember what you said about the second or third thing. And so again, you're lowering the plantation owner's expectations of what you can accomplish in a day. Something that's additional that's not on here is break tools. Perhaps you break the hoe that you're working with, or the axle breaks on the wagon. And again, you have to be sly about this, but if you do that, then you can't work that day. And so these are all non-violent ways of resisting that if you're caught, you probably won't be killed for. Now, of course, the more spectacular and the more famous way of resisting is to have an out-and-out rebellion. Now, these are very rare because, of course, the white plantation owner has all the weapons, he has all the power, and if you get caught, more often than not, you will be killed or sold into slavery. He might sell you, your plantation owner, because he sees you as a troublemaker, to the Caribbean or to Brazil, where your life expectancy is much lower. And so you have to be very desperate to want to organize a rebellion. But they did happen. The most famous one in this time period is the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. What happens near the Stono River, we have a group of about 20 Africans who decide they're going to rebel. And a core group of these Africans were warriors back in Africa, and they had recently been brought to the New World to be slaves, and so they are skilled. They still have hope that they can escape, and they're warriors. And so they plot this rebellion, and their plan is to build up enough slaves in their army, if you will, that they can march down south and get into Spanish Florida, which is not that far from South Carolina. Spanish Florida the Spanish have announced that any British slaves from the British colonies that move into Spanish Florida are free. And so here's a chance we can rebel, and then we can run away and we will be free. And so they rise up and they kill, about 40 or so white people in their rebellion, and they start marching south through South Carolina. But then the white militia is called out, and they attack in two separate battles. They'll attack the African Americans, and they will capture them, kill them, or like I said, re-enslave them and sell them to the Caribbean. And so it does not work very well for the African American, this rebellion, and all slave rebellions in what will be the United States are not successful. They will all fail. The only successful slave rebellion, of course, in the Americas is in Haiti, but that's not in the United States. There is another consequence of this, is that this freaks white Southerners out that their slaves are going to rebel and kill them. And so we have something called the Negro Act of 1740 that's passed in South Carolina as a result, and that will limit slaves' lives even more. This is the reaction against the Stono Rebellion. And so it'll make it illegal to teach slaves to read, because the leader of the Stono Rebellion was a literate slave, and they figure reading leads to knowledge, and knowledge leads to hope, and you can organize things, and that's not good. Next, it forbids slaves to congregate together without the express permission of their owner, which makes it hard to plan a slave rebellion. And then it also makes it illegal for a slave to be off a plantation without permission from their owner. And so the state militia is organized, and they will go around every so often. It was part of a slave owner's duty to form a posse, if you want to think of it that way, and ride around your county looking for any slaves that are off the plantation and check to see if they had papers giving them permission. So all of these things make it harder, life harder for African American slaves, and it tries to create more control over them in South Carolina. Now let's move on to the next section, life in New England, society in New England. And so what you should be thinking of here is, this would make a great comparison or contrast essay, is to compare and contrast New England society to Southern society. And let's start off by looking at New England towns. Unlike in the South, where they're too spread out to have very many towns, New England society is based around towns. So if we're talking about Rhode Island or Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Hampshire, these New England areas, they are centered on towns. If you remember, we had talked about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They came as a group. They wanted to stay together and form a perfect religious utopian community. And so from the very beginning, they're focused on community and setting up a town. And so they are clustered here together, and it's very communal. They support one another. So much different than the South. The South is all about hierarchy. We have the plantation elite on top, and we have all the poor white farmers underneath, and of course then we have the slaves underneath them, so very hierarchical. But here in New England, we're all together, trying to work together for the glory of God, living together, praying together, and so we see that it's very communal. All New England towns are centered around this thing called the village green, or the commons. We can see it on this map here. That's the center area. It's common pasture land, so everybody is sharing this resource, so everybody's cows can have something to graze on, and the houses all get centered around them. Everything's inward facing. Next, around the village green, of course, the first public building that will be built will be the church, because this is a religious community, and so everybody several times a week come together at the church to pray together. Next, either in the same building or later on they might build an additional building, we have the town hall. And this is what New England is famous for, their town halls. They have democracy. Every white male who owns property and who is a church member, he gets to vote. And so the community comes together and they vote together. So if I can stress this, I can't stress this enough, is that the New England societies are a community while the South is all spread out and hierarchical. Next, education. All New England children must learn to read and write, whether they're male or female, because they must learn to read the Bible. And so we see that New England communities are very literate. The South did not have this. In the South, they weren't focused on the Bible as much, so there wasn't a need to be able to learn to read and write. And in fact, the farmers who grew the tobacco really didn't need it for that either. And so there's very poor education in the South, but there's a high degree of education in the North. But there again, we see community. All the children in the village are coming together every day to learn to read and to write and to do math. And so again, more community. Now, I talked about education. Well, it's not coincidental that the first universities in America are in New England, in the Boston area. We're going to see Harvard University be the first university in 1636 because of the New England emphasis on the Bible. Harvard was created to train ministers to be able to preach to these new communities that are springing up throughout New England. Let's talk about New England families. If you remember, I had talked about Southern families, and in the first half of the 17th century, families were rare, and if they were there, they weren't very stable. But in New England, from the very beginning, from 1620 on, we're going to see that families exist. People came together as families. Women came to New England with their families. And so it is large families, extended families. The Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. So they have, the average woman at this time will have about 10 or so pregnancies in her lifetime. And so we see families are very tight-knit, more community. Next, we're going to see that people live longer in the New England colonies than they did in the South. Not only are they there supporting one another, giving each other food and support and helping each other out, which will make you live longer, but also we see that it's a healthier climate. There are fewer tropical diseases, it's less humid, there's less mosquitoes, and so we see that people live longer in New England. And so we have something new in human history, really. We have something called the development of grandparents. In the past, people in England or in Europe didn't live long enough to really have much of an impact on the lives of their children's children, but they do here in New England. Life expectancy in New England is higher, of course, than it is in the South, but it's also higher than it is back in England, because these people have access, unlike the middle and lower class people in England, the middle and lower class people in New England have access to their own land, so there's an abundance of food, so they live longer. New England women. If you remember, we talked about how women in the South had actually quite a few rights in the first half of the 17th century because they were so scarce and husbands were dying all the time. They could, inherit their family farm and they could pick and choose who they want their husband to be. However, we didn't talk about this, we might want to go back and add it. As we get later in Southern history, if we get into the last half of the 17th century, into the 18th century, as the male-female ratio evens out, we're going to see that women have fewer and fewer rights as they become more common. It'll be a very patriarchal society. So that is a change over time in the South. But here in New England, there is no change over time. Since women come to New England with their families, there is a pretty equal male to female ratio. And so since England is patriarchal, New England is going to be patriarchal. They bring that tradition with them. And so we see England rubbing off on its colonies in the New World. Women have very few rights. Their family is led by the male, their husband. So throughout her whole life, a woman is controlled by a man. When she's young, she's controlled by her father. When she's married, she's controlled by her husband. If she outlives her husband, then she might be controlled by her sons, who will inherit the family farm or will inherit the business. And so we see that since there is enough women in the North, equal number of men to women, we see that they stay a very patriarchal society, and there is really no change over time as far as gender roles in New England. So what is the role of a woman in New England? Well, she does help out on the farm, Of course, we need all hands on deck for that to make the farm a success, but a woman is also supposed to do domestic chores. She raises the children. She's the primary caregiver there. She's also responsible for cooking and cleaning and weaving, all of those things in the house. And so we see that New England women, yes, work out on the farm, but their major role is to do the domestic chores inside the home. A very patriarchal view of how the roles of men and women in society. Next, E, the New England experience changes. Like I said, we aren't going to see a change in gender roles in New England, but we are going to see a definite change in the overall social structure of New England. Number one, it says communal experience declines. In the early 1600s, from 1620 on, when the Pilgrims come to the New World, and then we have the Great Migration of all those Puritans coming, we see that they come as families, they come as communities. And so I've represented that here by having this rectangle. There isn't a lot of wealth difference. You don't see in this rectangle an extreme upper class way up above and a very poor lower class. They're kind of all close to the same wealth. They have near the same amount of land, the same amount of, their houses are about the same size. Their land plot is about the same size. And so it is a communal experience because everybody is sharing and helping each other because they want to create the perfect utopian community. But then as time passes and more immigrants come, and the colony becomes more a success, and life expectancy increases, and families are able to accumulate wealth over time, some families are just going to be richer than others, and it's typically families along the East Coast. The poor families have to move further inland and start their own farms, or the next generation has to move inland and start their own farms. And so we see the more well-established East Coast that not only farms, but is engaged in some small amount of artisan manufacturing and also shipbuilding and fishing. We see that the East Coast gets a little bit richer than the inland, which is very similar to the South. And so over time, as we get into the last half of the 17th century, we see that there is a hierarchical society that develops. We have rich and we have poor. And this goes against the New England ideology. Remember, the New England colonies were created to create a utopian community where everybody got along and helped each other out, but now we have rich and poor. So we see that this religious utopian experiment is starting to fail, and that's going to cause a great deal of anxiety among these very religious people. We used to be about God and helping each other out, and now as the century progresses, we're about wealth and materialism, and we're not so much focused on God and community. Here we see the different aspects of society. In the South, we see the planter elite on the top. In the North, we aren't going to have plantations because it's just too cold to grow cash crops. So the elite are going to be merchants, people engaged in perhaps that slave trade or sending raw materials to back to England. Then we have artisans, silversmiths, blacksmiths, those kinds of things. Small farmers, and then of course the land laborers. Notice we don't see a large number of slaves here because there's just no economic reason to have a lot of slavery. There are some slaves, but we just don't see an economic reason because we don't grow cash crops. There's not a big profit margin. What happened to the city upon a hill? Remember, we had talked about the utopian dream, and so I had mentioned that just a few minutes ago. This is going to create a lot of anxiety. We are not seemingly all in this together, and community is going away. So community experience declines continues. So I just gave you the economic reasons for why the community experience goes away, but there's another reason too. As New England becomes successful and people live longer, we see that they have very large families and more or less the children survive into adulthood. And so what do we do with all these extra children? Now, typically in English culture, when you have many children, the oldest male child will inherit the family farm. And then the other children, well, I'm sorry, you're out of luck. You better go find your own farm. This is called primogeniture. It means firstborn son is going to inherit everything. And so here we see our New England town, and the plots of land are all around the New England town. And so each little house owns some field on the outside. But let's say you have 10 kids and 7 of them survive. Well, you can't divide your land among all of the children because that plot of land just keeps getting so small. The more you divide it, that nobody could live on that small amount of land. There's not enough food being produced. In addition to that, English custom says that you give the land only to your firstborn son. So what happened to your second, third, fourth, fifth-born son? What do they get? They get nothing. And so what they have to do is these next generation and the generation after that, they have to go further west onto the frontier, chop down some trees, fight a Native American, and establish their own new town, establish a town further into the interior, which, by the way, of course, causes more conflict with Native Americans, which we'll talk about in future sets of notes, like King Philip's War would be an example of that. But we see that, of course, now we have a town further west that you can see on this diagram. And so what are these new young people who are living further west creating new towns? Are they really going to walk 5-10 miles several times a week to come to the village church through good weather and bad? I think not. And so we see that the society is getting separated physically now. We see that not everybody is coming to the same town hall meetings. They're not all going to the same school. They're not all going to the same church. And so we see that the younger generation is falling away from the church. They're distantly separated. They're separating themselves physically and emotionally and religiously from the older generation. So again, the city upon a hill, the utopian experience of this all being together is starting to fall apart. So this is going to cause tremendous soul-searching among the New England towns. A generational problem here is occurring. The older generation risked their lives to come here as a community, and they shared everything, and they were tight-knit, they were very religious, and the younger generation is moving away. They're falling away from God. They're not coming to church as much because of distance. They're more focused on wealth. There's a higher gap in society. And so this freaks the New England Puritans out. We are losing our mission from God. And so the first response to that is a series of sermons called Jeremiads. A Jeremiad is trying to literally scare the hell out of people. It's trying to scare people and get them to come back to church. They say, look, if you don't come to church as much, if you don't dedicate your life to God like your parents did in the older generations, you are going to hell. And hell is a very real place. To quote one of the sermons of the time, he said that the path to hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. You can imagine the fear that would create if you're one of these new parents who moved away and you had your own children and you haven't gotten around to baptizing them yet because your family's church is way, over the next to the coast. That's going to scare you to come back to church. And so these Jeremiads use emotion to bring people back to the church, but it's through fear. Next, here's another result of this tension that's resulting as community starts to fall apart. We get the halfway covenant. Now, when New England was first created, the people who could vote in the town hall were, like I said, they were property-owning, white males who were full members of the church. To be a full member of a Puritan church, you had to jump through a certain amount of hoops. You had to demonstrate that you were committed to God and the community. You had to be able to cite the Bible. You had to have your neighbors come and say that they have seen you do good works, that you are truly one of the elect, the visible saints, the chosen of God. But as the society falls apart, we see that people more focused on materialism. Like I said, we see them further moving to the west and not be able to come to church as much. And so the younger generation is not as willing to go or able to go through all of these hoops or stages to prove that they are a full member of the church. And so as church membership starts to decline, so does the amount of people who can vote in society, which creates political tension. Not just religious tension, but political tension, because now fewer and fewer people are able to vote in that town hall meeting. Just like in the South, the people on the East Coast, the older generation, they're able to vote because they've gone through all the members to the hoops to be a visible saint and elect a full member of the church. But the people further west, who are a little bit poor, newer settlements, they haven't. And so the East Coast is controlling the politics of the economy, of the colony, and the people further inland are not. And so this is creating a lot of friction. So what do we do to try to repair our society? To get the younger generation, the further west generation, to feel like they're part of us politically, we create the halfway covenant, which says that, look, you can be a voting member of our society because you will be a halfway member of the church. And so instead of having to go through all the hoops and ceremonies and demonstrations to demonstrate that you're a visible saint, you only have to go through a few. And so now you're a partial member of the church, and so we're going to say now you can vote. And so this allows more white men to vote, and so that calms tensions down for a while. So the halfway covenant is a way to bring people back to the politics, but also back to the church as well. So it's an example of this response to this growing tension. Finally, on this slide, what we see is there are other people moving to New England besides Puritans, and as more and more and more of them move to New England, they resent the Puritan control of their society, and so they, plus the Puritans' children who weren't coming to church, that could have been enough people to take over control of the colony. So when the Puritans created the halfway covenant for their children, that allowed the full visible saints to band together with the halfway covenant people to maintain control of the colony from these non-Puritans. All right, here's a more interesting, perhaps, response to this changing society, certainly a more famous one. We have the Salem witch trials of 1692. So you notice we're in the last part of the 17th century, and in Salem, a New England town, we see, just like in all of these New England towns, we see this tension growing between the coast and further inland, and it manifests itself in a way in something called the Salem witch trials. So what happens is the trials start that there was a group of girls who were spending the night at one of their friends' houses, young teenage-ish girls, and they were starting to, one of the servants of the parents who were having this kind of slumber party, if you will, she was a slave from the West Indies, and she knew voodoo. And so the girls were interested in what is this about, and so they found out about voodoo, and they got very scared when they were experimenting with this, and they were afraid that they were going to get found out. And so they did what a lot of young people do. They found a scapegoat. Instead of taking the blame and having their parents yell at them, they said that there were people in the village that it bewitched them and made them do this. And so they started, as you can see in this picture, they're starting to point fingers at different people in the community and saying that they're a witch or they're a warlock, and they're making us do these things. Well, when this starts, it starts out as a small group, but then it starts to spread because this hysteria kind of takes over. And it happens because it kind of keys in on this tension. People are already feeling tense about their changing society, and so this allows them to express some of their fears, this witch trial, and it just manifests, and more people already on edge because of the changes in society think, wow, this must be caused because of all the witches and the warlocks in our society. And so we see that it spreads, and more people start to take advantage of this, and either doing this on purpose because if they say that person's a witch or a warlock, they're able to, get their enemy killed because these people all often end up either pressed to death by heavy rocks or hung, or they're just legitimately afraid and they don't know why their society is changing, and so it manifests in saying that this person over here who's weird, who doesn't fit in, is a witch. And so we see that we have 17 or so women will be hung, and like I said, one man will be pressed to death, and this seems to be getting more and more out of control. And eventually, when the governor's wife is accused of being a witch, the governor stops it. He says, this is nonsense. My wife's not a witch. Enough. And that brings the Salem witch trial to a close. But this is an example of how tense things were in Salem, in New England, and how it can manifest itself into terror. Interestingly, I read a book a few years ago, the name escapes me, and he did a survey of the Salem witch trials, and what he found out was that most of the people doing the accusing were inland, and most of the people who were accused were along the coast. So one could look at this as an example of east-west tension, that the poor people inland were resentful of the richer people along the coast, and so this manifested itself, this tension and this anger, this east-west tension into the Salem witch trials. Interesting theory. Next, as our final response to this changing society in New England, we have the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening. It's in the mid-1730s. It's not like it happens on one day. It gradually builds, it becomes a big thing, and then it'll eventually kind of fade away. But the high point is in the 1730s, and it's definitely an example of this social change. And so if you remember, we said that the Jeremiads were an example of this social tension. We saw the Halfway Covenant. We saw the Salem witch trials. And now we have the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, as this name applies, is going to be a great religious reawakening. People are going to get very emotional, excited about their Christian faith in the 1730s. And it'll sweep through all of the colonies, not just in New England. So its causes, one, is this loss of utopia that I've been talking about, this tension between East and West in New England and the loss of community. But also, as I had talked about, these people who are very religious people in New England, they're afraid that they are falling away from God. And so when this Great Awakening starts, it allows them to get emotional again and reconnect with their religion. It also is because of this idea of this loss of disparity, this loss of commonality, this communal living, that there's this great disparity in wealth. People are more materialistic than they should be. They're too focused on having things and getting money and getting powerful, and not helping your fellow man and being dedicated to the Bible. And so all of these currents that are going on in New England society, they'll express themselves in a desire to be religious again, to reconnect with their faith, and it's the Great Awakening. Another cause of the Great Awakening is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is going on in Europe, and it's spread to the colonies. And the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution is this idea that man can figure out how nature and science works. Man can control their own future and destiny. It's all about humans controlling things. And these people who are very religious, they think, no, that's not right. That can't be right. We are controlled by God. He's omniscient and omnipotent, and we should rebel against that. We should reject that. And so it's another example of one of the causes people rejecting, to some degree, the Enlightenment. So we need leaders for this movement. So one of them is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, he comes along and he tries to get people to be religious again and to come back to God in an emotional way. That's a characteristic of the Great Awakening. It's all about reconnecting with God on an emotional level. And so he has this famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And really it's a Jeremiah, just like we've seen before. He tells you that we are all sinners and we are like a spider in God's hand. And he is about to tip his hand over the burning pit of hell, dropping you and your soul into hell. It's a very vivid image. And he's trying to say, look, come back to God. It's emotional because it's using fear, but he says, come back to God, reconnect with him because you don't want to go to eternal damnation. And so Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, part of the Great Awakening. But the next guy we have is George Whitefield. As we see in the right-hand picture, George Whitefield also uses emotion, but he's using a different emotion. He's using joy. He goes around and he has these big open-air camp meetings, and because the crowds are too big to fit in churches, and he tells people that Jesus loves you, God loves you, he wants you to come back, and you can feel tremendous joy and forgiveness and love and community. And that also brings people back. It's also emotional to their faith. So what's the impact on society of the Great Awakening? Well, it's split. Oddly enough, even though we're concerned about society being split apart, and we're trying to bring society back together, the end result of the Great Awakening is to actually split society apart even more into the old lights and the new lights. Now, the old lights are going to be the old elite. They're going to be the people along the East Coast, the people who are full church members, the people who are the rich merchants, the people who are in control of the ports, established families. They don't want their religion to change and their society to change because, well, they are on the top of society. They are the wealthiest people in society. And so when the Great Awakening comes along that says we should have emotion in our faith and everybody can connect with God, you don't have to go through a minister or a preacher. Everybody can read the Bible for themselves. They think, oh, no, this is bad. Right? They don't want society to change. They like the hierarchy in society. They want society to stay the same, because they're on top of it. However, the new lights, they're rebelling against society. The Great Awakening, George Whitefield says that you don't need to be a minister trained in Harvard to interpret the Bible. Anybody can interpret the Bible and God's love for themselves, so it makes it a much more democratic religious faith. And it's very emotional. You don't have to be intellectual to be next to God. Like I said, you don't have to go to Harvard. You can interpret it yourself, and you can interpret it through emotion. And so the new lights are primarily going to be people who are further inland, less educated, on the bottom of society. And this is a chance for them to take control of their faith again. They don't have to do what the East Coast elite ministers tell them to do. Now they can lead their own service. They can read the Bible for themselves. And so it certainly is, you can look at it as a democratic movement, but also East-West tension. And so we have the old lights versus the new lights, the people rejecting the Great Awakening and the people who are accepting it wholeheartedly. Now, at this time, we see a new not faith, but a new sect of Christianity coming in to the American colonies, and they are Methodists and Baptists. And the Methodists and Baptists, at this time, they are part of the New Lights. They are accepting the faith. It's very emotional. It's very democratic. We can all be part of it. And they will spread like wildfire, especially in the upcountry, from New England all the way down through the middle colonies, down to the south. And so we'll see that Methodists and Baptists will be a new driving force in society. Of course, the Old Lights are going to be some of the more established versions of Christianity. They're going to be the Anglicans in the South, and they're going to be what we call the Congregationalists in New England. The Congregationalists are what were the original Puritans and the Pilgrims, more or less. And so we're going to see that they're going to reject this. So we have a religious split going on here as well. Last thing on this slide is we see that the First Great Awakening is going to be something that's the first truly shared experience of all 13 colonies. If you have noticed by now, hopefully, that each colony has its own unique history, its own social and economic structure, and so there's nothing really to unite them except that they're all English colonies. And some of them aren't even mostly English, like we talked about. Some of them are mostly Dutch, or some of them are mostly German, or have a high German population. And so this is going to be something that we can build on. Eventually, as we get to our next unit and we talk about the American Revolution, we have to come together if we're going to fight the British. And so to do that, you have to have a common shared experiences. And this is going to be one of those things that eventually will start knitting the colonies together. There's going to be Methodists and Baptists in all of the colonies. All of the colonies will have this First Great Awakening experience that they can all touch on and say, this makes us American. And that's the end of our slide show.